Imagine you are walking down the street when someone hands you a simple riddle. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? An answer leaps into your mind almost instantly, fully formed, confident. 10 cents. It feels obvious. It feels right. And it is wrong. If the ball cost 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, the bat would be $1.10, and together they would cost $1.20, not $1.10. The correct answer is 5 cents. What is fascinating here is not that people get this wrong. It is how they get it wrong. The wrong answer does not come from careful reasoning that made a mistake. It comes from a fast, automatic process in your mind that produced an answer before you had a chance to think, and then handed it to you dressed up as the truth. Most people never check it. They feel certain and they move on. This little riddle is a doorway into one of the most important books written about the human mind in the last half-century. It is a book about the machinery of thought, about the two very different ways your brain generates beliefs and makes choices, and about the systematic, predictable errors that machinery produces. The book is called Thinking, Fast and Slow, and today I want to walk with you through its central ideas, its surprises, and its uncomfortable lessons about how little we actually understand ourselves. By the end, you may find that you trust your own certainty a little less, and that this distrust is one of the most valuable gifts a book can give you. The book was written by Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist whose career reshaped how economists, doctors, judges, and ordinary people think about decision-making. Kahneman was born in Tel Aviv in 1934 and spent part of his childhood in France during the Nazi occupation, a period of hiding and fear that he later credited with giving him an early, vivid interest in the strangeness of human behavior. He became a psychologist in Israel, and the defining collaboration of his life began when he met Amos Tversky, another brilliant psychologist with a completely different temperament. Kahneman was anxious, self-doubting, always circling back to question his own conclusions. Tversky was confident, sharp, and quick. Together, across the 1970s and beyond, they produced a series of experiments and papers that quietly detonated a set of assumptions economics had rested on for 2 centuries. The assumption they attacked was the idea of the rational human being. Traditional economics had long assumed that people, on the whole, make choices that serve their own interests in logically consistent ways. They weigh costs and benefits, they respect the laws of probability, they are not swayed by irrelevant details. Kahneman and Tversky showed, again and again, in careful and reproducible experiments, that real human beings do none of these things reliably. We are swayed by how a question is worded. We ignore statistics that should govern our judgments. We are terrified of losing far more than we are excited by winning. And crucially, our errors are not random. They are systematic. They lean in predictable directions, which means they can be studied, mapped, and, sometimes, guarded against. This work eventually earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, a remarkable honor for a man who had never taken a single economics course. Tversky, tragically, had died in 1996, and Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously, so Kahneman received it partly on behalf of them both. Thinking, Fast and Slow, published in 2011, is his attempt to gather a lifetime of this research into one accessible volume for the general reader. It is not a light book. It asks you to think carefully about thinking, which is a strange and sometimes dizzying exercise. But it rewards the effort with a new vocabulary for understanding your own mind. The organizing idea of the entire book is a distinction between 2 modes of thinking, which Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. These are not real structures in the brain. There is no little region you could point to and label System 1. They are characters in a story, a useful fiction that helps us talk about 2 very different styles of mental activity. System 1 is fast, automatic, effortless, and always running. It is the part of your mind that reads the emotion on a face the instant you see it, that completes the phrase bread, and that tells you 2 plus 2 without any sense of effort, that swerves the car before you have consciously registered the danger. It is intuitive, associative, and deeply skilled at the things it does well. It is also gullible, prone to jumping to conclusions, and utterly confident even when it should not be. System 1 does not do doubt. It constructs the best possible story from whatever information is available and presents that story to you as reality. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful, and lazy. It is the part of your mind you engage when you multiply 17 by 24, when you fill out a tax form, when you carefully compare two apartments, when you try to hold your tongue during an argument. System 2 is where we experience the feeling of choosing, of concentrating, of being the agent of our own thoughts. We tend to identify with System 2. We think of it as who we really are, the rational conscious self. But Kahneman gently and repeatedly undermines this flattering picture. System 2, he shows, is often little more than an endorser of System 1's suggestions. It believes it is in charge, while in fact most of what we think and do originates in the fast, automatic system, and System 2 simply signs off on it. The reason this matters is that System 2 is expensive. Deliberate thinking consumes energy and attention, and we have a limited supply. There is a wonderful demonstration of this called the invisible gorilla experiment, where viewers asked to count basketball passes completely fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the middle of the scene. When System 2 is fully occupied, we become effectively blind to things that should be obvious. Because deliberate thought is costly, we ration it. We default to System 1 whenever we can, which is most of the time. And this is not a flaw we can simply decide to overcome. It is the fundamental economics of the mind. The fast system is doing almost all the work, and it is doing it with a set of shortcuts that usually serve us well, but sometimes lead us badly astray. Those shortcuts are what psychologists call heuristics, and understanding them is the heart of Kahneman's work. A heuristic is a simple procedure that helps find adequate, if imperfect, answers to difficult questions. The mind faces a hard question, and instead of answering it directly, it quietly swaps in an easier question and answers that one instead. This substitution happens without our awareness. We feel as though we have answered the hard question, when in fact we have answered a different one. Consider the anchoring effect, one of the most robust findings in all of psychology. If I ask you whether Gandhi was more or less than 140 years old when he died, and then ask you to estimate his actual age at death, your estimate will tend to be higher than if I had first asked whether he was more or less than 35. The first number, however absurd, becomes an anchor that drags your estimate toward it. This works even when the anchor is completely random, even when you know it is random. In one striking demonstration, experienced judges were asked to roll dice that were secretly loaded and then to recommend a prison sentence for a shoplifter. Judges who rolled higher numbers recommended longer sentences. The number on the dice had nothing to do with the crime, and yet it moved their expert judgment. Anchoring is everywhere in commerce. The suggested retail price, the first offer in a negotiation, the largest number on a menu, all of these plant anchors that shape what we are willing to pay. Then there is the availability heuristic. When we try to judge how common or how likely something is, we do not perform a survey. We ask how easily examples come to mind. Things that are vivid, recent, or emotionally charged come to mind easily, and so we overestimate their frequency. After seeing news coverage of a plane crash, people overestimate the danger of flying, even though flying is extraordinarily safe. We fear the dramatic and the memorable, tornadoes, sharks, terrorism, while underweighting the quiet and the common, strokes, diabetes, car accidents. The ease of recall stands in for actual probability, and the two are often badly mismatched. Perhaps the most famous of these shortcuts is representativeness, which Kahneman illustrates with a character named Linda. Participants read a description of Linda as a single woman, deeply concerned with social justice and discrimination, who as a student had participated in demonstrations. Then they were asked which was more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller who is also active in the feminist movement. A large majority chose the second option. But this is logically impossible. The group of feminist bank tellers is a subset of the group of all bank tellers. There cannot be more of them than there are bank tellers in total. Adding a detail that fits our mental image of Linda makes the story feel more plausible, even as it makes the statement less probable. We judge by resemblance to a stereotype rather than by the cold logic of probability. This is called the conjunction fallacy, and it reveals how deeply our intuitions can conflict with the rules of reason. Alongside these lies a bias Kahneman labels with a memorable phrase, "What you see is all there is." System 1 builds its confident stories using only the information immediately available to it. It does not pause to consider what it does not know. It does not naturally ask whether the evidence is sufficient or reliable. It simply takes whatever fragments are present and weaves them into a coherent narrative, and the coherence of that narrative creates a feeling of confidence. This is why we can form strong impressions of people from a single meeting, why first impressions are so powerful, and why we are so often overconfident. The very ease with which our minds construct a story fools us into trusting it. This brings us to one of the book's most humbling themes, our chronic overconfidence and our persistent illusion that we understand the world better than we do. Kahneman argues that the human mind has an almost irresistible urge to make sense of things, to find causes, to build stories that explain the past. And these stories feel like understanding. But they're frequently illusions. Consider what he calls the narrative fallacy. We look back on events and construct tidy causal tales. A company succeeded because its leader was bold and visionary. A war was lost because of a single decision. These stories give us a comforting sense that the world is orderly and comprehensible. But they systematically overweight the role of skill and intention and underweight the enormous role of luck. When we read that a successful executive made a series of brilliant moves, we forget how much of business outcomes are determined by factors no one controls. The stories we tell about success are far too clean. Kahneman is blunt about this. A great deal of what looks like skill in the world, especially in domains like the stock market, is very close to luck, and the people at the top are often simply the ones who happen to be fortunate. Closely related is hindsight bias, our tendency to believe, after something has happened, that we knew it was going to happen all along. Once we know the outcome, we cannot easily reconstruct the genuine uncertainty we felt beforehand. The past becomes inevitable in our memory. This distorts how we judge decisions. We criticize a good decision that led to a bad outcome and praise a reckless decision that happened to pay off, because we evaluate the choice by its result rather than by the quality of the reasoning at the time. This is deeply unfair, and it makes it hard to learn the right lessons from experience. Kahneman also draws a sharp and important distinction between two kinds of expertise. In some environments, genuine expert intuition is real and trustworthy. A firefighter who senses that a building is about to collapse, a chess master who sees the right move at a glance. These people have developed valid intuitions through long practice in a stable, predictable world that gives clear, rapid feedback. But in other environments, the confident intuitions of experts are worth very little. Stock pickers, political forecasters, and many others operate in worlds too noisy and unpredictable for real skill to develop, and yet they feel just as confident as the genuine experts. The subjective feeling of confidence, Kahneman warns, tells us almost nothing about whether a judgment is actually accurate. Confidence is a feeling produced by the coherence of a story and the ease with which the mind constructed it, not a reliable measure of truth. He also discusses the planning fallacy, our tendency to make plans and forecasts that are unrealistically close to best-case scenarios. Almost every large project, whether a home renovation or a national infrastructure program, comes in later and more expensive than planned, and this happens over and over, and yet we never seem to learn. The remedy he offers is to take what he calls the outside view, to look at the actual track record of similar projects rather than getting lost in the specific details of your own case, which always feels special and always feels like it will go smoothly. The next great pillar of the book concerns how we make decisions involving risk and money, and here Kahneman describes the work that most directly won him the Nobel Prize. For a long time, economists modeled human choice using something called expected utility theory, which assumed that people evaluate outcomes in terms of their final states of wealth. Kahneman and Tversky showed that this is not how people actually think, and they proposed a better description of real behavior, which they called prospect theory. The first insight is that we do not think in terms of absolute wealth. We think in terms of changes, gains and losses, measured against a reference point, which is usually our current situation. Whether a given amount of money feels like a gain or a loss depends entirely on where we started. Getting $1,000 feels wonderful if you expected nothing, and disappointing if you expected 2,000. The mind is a difference detector, tuned to changes rather than to levels. The second and more powerful insight is loss aversion. Losses loom larger than gains. The pain of losing $100 is considerably more intense than the pleasure of gaining $100. Studies suggest that, roughly speaking, a loss feels about twice as powerful as an equivalent gain. This asymmetry has enormous consequences. It makes us reluctant to take gambles that are actually favorable. If I offer you a coin flip where you lose $100 on tails, but win $150 on heads, most people refuse, even though the bet is clearly worth taking on average. The looming threat of the loss overwhelms the larger potential gain. Loss aversion explains why we cling to losing investments, hoping to break even rather than accept a loss. It explains why negotiations are so hard, because each side feels its own concessions as painful losses. It is one of the most important forces in economic life. The third insight involves how we handle probabilities. We do not treat probabilities in a straight, linear way. We overweight small probabilities and underweight large ones. This is why we buy lottery tickets, giving too much psychological weight to a tiny chance of an enormous prize, and why we buy insurance, paying to eliminate a small chance of a loss, because the mere possibility looms so large in our minds. It is also why a change from a 95% chance of success to 100% certainty feels so much more valuable than a change from 60 to 65%, even though the improvement in probability is the same. We crave certainty, and we are haunted by even remote possibilities. Finally, Kahneman emphasizes framing effects, the way that logically identical choices produce different decisions depending on how they are worded. A medical treatment described as having a 90% survival rate is far more attractive than the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though these are the same fact. Meat labeled 90% lean sells better than meat labeled 10% fat. A rational agent would see through the wording to the underlying reality. Real human beings respond to the frame because System 1 reacts to the emotional coloring of the words rather than to the abstract equivalence beneath them. This means that whoever controls the framing of a choice, a doctor, a politician, a marketer, holds enormous power over the decision, and we are far more manipulable than we would like to believe. In the final movement of the book, Kahneman turns to a question that sounds simple but turns out to be profound. What does it mean to be happy, and what do we actually want from our lives? Here he introduces a distinction between two selves that live inside each of us, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the one who lives in the present moment, who actually feels the pleasure and the pain as they happen, second by second. The remembering self is the one who keeps score, who tells the story of our life afterward, who decides how the vacation was, how the relationship was, how the whole thing went. And these two selves do not agree. Worse, they have conflicting interests, and it is the remembering self that makes our decisions, because we cannot act on experiences that are already gone. We act on our memories of them. Kahneman demonstrates the gap between these selves with a set of unsettling experiments. In one, people held their hands in painfully cold water. In the short version, they endured 60 seconds of cold. In the long version, they endured the same 60 seconds and then 30 additional seconds during which the water was warmed slightly, still unpleasant but less so. The long version contains strictly more total pain, more seconds of suffering. And yet, when asked which trial they would prefer to repeat, most people chose the longer one. Their remembering self preferred more total suffering because the experience ended on a better note. This reveals two strange rules about how memory evaluates experience. The first is what he calls duration neglect. The length of an experience has almost no effect on how we remember it. A 2-week vacation is not remembered as twice as good as a 1-week vacation. The second is the peak end rule. Our memory of an experience is dominated by how it felt at its most intense moment and how it felt at the very end, while everything in between is largely discarded. This is why a wonderful trip can be ruined in memory by a bad final day, and why the total quantity of pleasure or pain matters far less than we would expect. These findings raise deep and troubling questions about how we should live and what we should pursue. Do we live for the sequence of moments we actually experience, or for the story we will be able to tell about our lives? We spend enormous effort choosing experiences less for how they will feel and more for the memories they will produce. We take photographs instead of looking. We choose the impressive over the pleasant. Kahneman does not resolve this tension, and he is honest that it may not be resolvable. But simply seeing it clearly changes how you think about your choices, your vacations, your relationships, and even the way you might wish to face the end of your own life. So, what should we carry away from this remarkable book? The first and largest lesson is a lesson in humility. Your mind is not the reliable, rational instrument you feel it to be. Most of what you think and believe arises from a fast, automatic system that jumps to conclusions, that is easily fooled, and that never tells you when it is uncertain. The confident feeling of knowing is not proof of knowledge. Learn to hold your own certainty a little more lightly. The second lesson is that our errors are systematic, not random, and this is actually good news. Because biases lean in predictable directions, we can learn to recognize the situations where they strike. When you feel a number pulling on your estimate, suspect anchoring. When a story feels too clean and too obvious, suspect the narrative fallacy and hindsight bias. When a vivid example drives your fear, suspect availability. When a decision hinges on how something was worded, suspect framing. You cannot switch off these biases in yourself. Kahneman is refreshingly honest that, even after decades of studying them, he still falls for them constantly. But you can learn to spot the danger signs and slow down. The third lesson is the power of the outside view and of statistics. When making a forecast or a plan, resist the seductive details of your particular case and ask instead about the base rates, the track record of similar cases. The specifics always make your situation feel unique. The statistics usually know better. The fourth lesson concerns loss aversion and the reference point. Recognize that your fear of losing distorts your choices, that you weight the same dollar differently depending on whether you frame it as a gain or a loss, and that this can lead you to cling to bad situations and refuse good bets. Seeing this can help you make braver, wiser decisions. The fifth lesson is that improvement is easier for institutions than for individuals. Because we cannot easily correct our own biases in the moment, the most reliable defenses are external. Checklists, algorithms, formal procedures, and the disciplined habit of consulting the outside view all help. Organizations can build in a step where someone is assigned to argue the other side, or where forecasts are checked against real historical data. Kahneman even suggests a practice he calls the pre-mortem, where before committing to a plan, a group imagines that it is a year later and the plan has failed disastrously, and then everyone writes down why. This licenses doubt that would otherwise be suppressed, and often surfaces risks that the group's optimism had hidden. Thinking, Fast and Slow is not a self-help book, and Kahneman is careful never to promise that reading it will make you smarter or free you from error. If anything, his conclusion is the opposite. He tells us plainly that after a lifetime of studying these mental traps, his own intuitions are barely improved. He still sees the illusions even when he knows they are illusions, the way an optical illusion keeps fooling your eye no matter how many times you measure the lines and confirm they are equal. The biases are not bugs we can simply delete. They are woven into the architecture of the mind, features of a system that evolved to make quick decisions in a dangerous world, a system that is astonishingly capable and yet systematically flawed. What the book offers instead is something subtler and, I think, more valuable. It gives us a richer language for talking about our own minds and the minds of others. It lets us say, this feels like an anchoring effect, or I am neglecting the base rate here, or my remembering self and my experiencing self want different things. This vocabulary does not make us perfect, but it makes us better observers of ourselves, and it makes our conversations about difficult decisions more honest. It is far easier to notice a colleague's overconfidence than your own, and if a shared language lets us gently point out one another's blind spots, then collectively we can reason better than any of us can alone. There is also, underneath all the experiments and the graphs, a deep compassion in this book. Kahneman spent his life documenting human irrationality, and yet he does not sneer at it. He sees our biases not as stupidity, but as the natural output of a mind doing its extraordinary best with limited resources. We are not fools. We are creatures running remarkable, ancient software that usually works beautifully and occasionally misfires in ways we can now begin to understand. To know this is to be a little more forgiving of ourselves and of others, a little slower to judge, a little quicker to check our own certainty before we act on it. So the next time an answer leaps into your mind, fully formed and utterly convincing, remember the bat and the ball. Remember that the feeling of being right is manufactured by a system that does not know how to doubt. Pause. Engage that slow, lazy, effortful second system, just for a moment. Ask whether the easy answer is really the true one. You will still be wrong sometimes, perhaps often. But in the gap between the fast answer and the slow check, in that small deliberate pause, lies whatever wisdom we are actually capable of. That pause is the quiet, hard-won gift of this book, and it is worth carrying with you long after the final page.